A few years ago, my loom had sat gathering dust for months, and I made the decision to reclaim my dining room and disassemble it. Actually, to be honest, I decided my weaving days were done and I would sell it or even give it away to someone who would love it and use it again. But in the end, the universe had other plans, I guess, and it sat disassembled like a pile of sticks tucked away in a corner. Of course, my weaving creativity came back eventually, but life is busy and my dining room was now in use, so I ended up buying a small folding Saori loom, which I enjoy weaving with. But the pile of sticks kept calling my name. A Saori loom only really does plain weave, but I miss the texture and big projects and the ease of using a really large loom. I didn't want to just make scarves, so I made the decision it was time to put the big loom back together. Assembling an old loom is not like assembling IKEA furniture. I wanted to take care to clean each piece before reassembling and take my time making sure I didn't damage anything as I worked. The frame structure of the loom is simple and it's held together by bolts and nuts at the bottom. I've had a few different looms over my 10 plus years of weaving, and while they've all had different benefits, I can tell you that this old Leclerc Fanny Counterbalance loom is by far my favorite. I bought it from an estate and it was previously owned by a beloved and active weaving guild member a few hours from where I live. Her friends from the guild gave me a quick rundown on the loom, and I brought it home in pieces with absolutely no idea how to assemble it. I had never used a loom this big. So I recruited my dad and we figured out how to assemble it in my then studio. Eventually, I took it apart again and moved it, and of course I took it apart again, only to be here assembling it once more. Leclerc is a Canadian loom manufacturer that's been around for a very long time. They're known as these workhorse looms, sturdy, simple, consistent, and fast, and I love that it's just simple screws, nuts, bolts, and solid wood. If I lose something or need a replacement part, my local hardware store is usually as far as I need to go. The previous owner had included this odd little square piece of wood, and I learned that it actually perfectly turns the bolts without over-tightening anything, even in small little spaces. I have no idea if she made it or found it, but it's one of those small inheritances that comes with the well-loved loom. Someone solved this problem before me. At this point, I should have added the back section, but I forgot, so alas, you'll see me struggle with that a little later on. There are two beams that rotate on the loom. This main one in the middle is where your work is attached to, and as you weave, it's quick and easy to advance your finished work so it wraps around as you go. It sits freely in the frame and gets secured in place by these latches. The Leclerc Fanny loom is a classic example of a counterbalance loom. It's built on a system that's been used for centuries. Counterbalance looms trace back to traditional European weaving, where weavers needed a reliable way to create strong, even cloth. The design uses pulleys and rollers to connect shafts in opposing pairs, so when one set of threads rises, the other lowers automatically. The Fanny loom, made by Leclerc Looms in Quebec, carries that tradition forward. It was first introduced in the mid-20th century, and it became very popular for its sturdy construction, smooth treadling, and ability to maintain even tension across the warp. On this loom, the shafts are balanced over rollers at the top, so when you push a treadle down with your foot, you're not just lifting threads, you're shifting a balance. One shaft goes up, the other goes down, creating a clean, consistent shed for the shuttle to pass through. Because of this system, the Fanny loom excels at weaving balanced structures like plain weave, where even tension really matters. It's a simple idea, but it's incredibly effective, and it's part of why these looms are still used and loved by weavers today. These are the shafts, the frames that carry the threads across the loom, and the small metal loops that are strung between them are called heddles. Each heddle has a tiny eye in its center, and every single warp thread passes through one of those eyes. That is how the loom sorts out which threads go up and which thread goes down every time you push a foot treadle. These long pieces of wood are the treadles, the foot pedals of the loom. Each one is hinged at the back and connected by cords up through the lambs to the shafts. When you press a treadle with your foot, those cords pull on the shafts, so one goes up and one goes down, and that shifts the counterbalance, which parts your warp threads so you can weave with the shuttle in between. Leclerc makes their treadles from solid hardwood, so even after years of use and storage, they're in beautiful shape. I'm just cleaning them partially for the dust, but also just the satisfaction of handling something that is so well made. To be honest, weaving with foot treadles completely changed my weaving journey. They are so good. It's one of the reasons why I think I will never go back to another style of loom. It just has a beautiful rhythm and movement between your hands and your feet working together. Next up, I'm going to attach the lams, L-A-M-S. They're the intermediate connection between the treadles below and the shafts above. So that is what translates what your feet are doing to what's happening with the yarn. When you tie each treadle to specific shafts through the lams, you're determining which ones move up and which ones move down based on the pedal that you step on. This process is called the tie-up, and it's what lets you weave entirely different structures on the same loom. When you change the tie-up, you change the pattern of what you're weaving. If that sounds very confusing, don't worry, it'll make a lot more sense once you're sitting at a loom with your feet moving. The logic of this makes a lot of sense and becomes physical very quickly once you start to actually move your feet and hands. And there's a little crank that connects to the cloth beam. It's how you advance your finish weaving as you work. Now I'm going to turn the loom around to tackle the back beam, which, if you recall, I should have done at the very beginning. This is what we like to call learning by doing. So this is the part where it gets uncomfortable. I wish I had a second person with me, but the back beam needs to be hinged at just the right angle so the screws can seat properly into the wood. In theory, straightforward, but in practice, I'm alone. The loom is heavy, and I'm essentially balancing it across my lap while simultaneously trying to hold a hinge in position and drive in a screw. I want you to see this because I think we have a habit of only showing the polished version of putting things back together, the clean cuts and the before and after, but reassembly is rarely graceful. It's a lot of, hold on, let me just, I'm going to try it this way, and awkward angles and quietly reconsidering your choices. There's nothing elegant about this particular stage, but there's something honest about it, and this is what it actually looks like to work alone on something that matters to you. I keep thinking about the fact that this loom has been taken apart and reassembled in multiple homes by multiple pairs of hands, my dad's hands, my hands, and before that, whoever built it in the workshop in Quebec, probably decades ago. There's something in that continuity that I find really amazing. This loom outlasts the circumstances that tried to end it, but also carries the energy of many people who have loved and used it over time. There are all these special little things because this is a used loom. And so the previous owners or the guild, they had taped these little samples of yarn sizes, reminders of what number the foot treadle is. There's all these little notes on it that were passed down from previous owners. And I love this idea that as a traditional craft that obviously was passed down through generations as well, that there's real rich history that is a part of each piece that I make because of the previous hands that have used this loom. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it's always on my mind as I sit down to work on something that I am not the first and certainly will not be the last person to use this beautiful loom. And putting it back together is a really good reminder that that history is something that is important and to be carried on, and that we do that through used pieces. Not to mention, it's way cheaper to buy a used loom, even one that's big and old like this one, compared to buying a brand new loom. And well, yes, there are pros to owning a new loom as well. You do have, all the little kinks and things that you might have when you buy something new have been worked out by a previous owner. And it just makes it such a different experience to not have to figure those out because someone else has already done that in this journey before you. The next part, I cut a lot of it out because it was a lot of problem solving, but just know that probably the trickiest part of putting a loom back together is figuring out the brake mechanism. I will be honest, at this point, I was just super frustrated with why it wasn't working properly. The brake mechanism is on the back beam and it controls the tension on your warp. So when you're ready to advance your weaving, you release the brake slightly by this piece of wood that's along the side of your loom, and it lets the beam rotate, and then it locks back into place to hold your tension steady while you work. I understood what I was supposed to do. In fact, this was the only piece that I replaced when I got this loom, so I have had to do this brake several times. But for whatever reason, I just logically couldn't figure it out. It's a very humbling moment, and it certainly is more frustrating considering I've already had to do this multiple times before, but I cannot figure out how it connects. There is no amount of experience that protects you from that moment. You just have to be willing to sit with not knowing for a while and trying to figure it out. Luckily, there were some instructions, and so I did pull those out, except that they were for a slightly different version of the Fanny loom and it had a different piece, so they didn't actually help me. Essentially, there is this metal piece that wraps around the beam. It has to connect to that little piece of metal there. You've got a hole on one side and a hole on the other, and one side connects to the brake and the other side connects to the spring. And then that cord that I'm holding connects to the piece of wood that you use to put pressure on the brake so that it stops moving. And I kept putting them on and taking them off and could not figure out how to get it done. I even pulled out ChatGPT to see if it could help me figure it out. But eventually I realized I couldn't reach all the way around because the piece of metal, the metal coil, needed a little bit more room. So I took it all off, put it back together, attached the cord to the right spot, attached the spring, and now it's working properly. Again, this is the learning by doing portion of the video, but it did eventually work out. So next up, I am removing these little spacers that are at the back, and at the time I could not remember what they were for, and then as soon as I took them off, I realized that they were an important part of the sectional warp kit, and so 30 seconds later, I put them all back on. If you are familiar with weaving but have never tried a sectional warp, I highly recommend it. It's a method of warping where instead of taking one long continuous thread, like winding it on your warping board or warping mill, and then putting it on the loom, which can be really difficult when you're working on your own or if you're working on a long project, this has you take your yarn, divide it up onto bobbins, and then you basically rotate it onto the back beam in 1-inch sections. And so there are little dividers that keep each section separated and evenly spaced across the beam. And so if you ever have issues with tension, it is simply the greatest solution to your issues. You do use a little tension box, which luckily came with my sectional warp kit, and that helps your threads to stay under pressure and stay in line, and so that they wrap really nicely on the beam. And honestly, it's super fast and it's way less opportunity for error, I guess you could say, than when you're winding on a warp and trying to keep it separated and keep your crosses lined up and all of those types of things. I just find this to be a much better way for me to weave. And then finally, the crank. This is the last piece, and when it's put in place, I want to tell you I was so grateful this was done. This loom came home in pieces from somebody else's house. It spent years in my studio and then in a corner and then in storage. And here it is again, whole and ready to be used for my next project.